Cold was as dangerous an enemy in World War II as bullets and artillery. Soldiers fighting in Europe, the Soviet Union, and parts of Asia spent months living in tents through brutal winters, often without reliable fuel or heavy equipment. Out of necessity, military engineers refined a simple tent modification that consistently reduced heat loss by roughly 40%. It was not a heater, not thicker fabric, and not a technological breakthrough. It was the deliberate creation of a controlled air layer inside the shelter. This method is largely absent from modern homes, despite being cheap, effective, and adaptable. If you care about historical practicality and real-world survival knowledge, this technique deserves close attention. The wartime tent method relied on a suspended inner layer rather than thicker walls. The core of the World War II system was a double-envelope structure. Military tents were fitted with an inner liner made of canvas, wool blend fabric, or even treated cotton sheeting. This liner was not attached tightly to the outer tent wall. It was hung several inches inward, creating a sealed pocket of still air between the outer shell and the inner living space. That trapped air became the real insulation. Tests conducted by Allied engineers showed that this dead air layer reduced convective and radiant heat loss dramatically, often approaching 40% compared to a single wall tent under the same conditions. This mattered because fabric alone does very little to stop heat loss. Even heavy canvas bleeds heat quickly when wind strips warmth from the surface. The liner broke that process. Wind could cool the outer shell, but it could not reach the inner layer. Radiant heat from bodies and stoves was reflected back inward, and convection currents were slowed to a crawl. The liner worked because it controlled airflow, not because it added bulk. One of the most misunderstood aspects of insulation is thickness versus stillness. World War II engineers understood that moving air steals heat far faster than cold material. The liner's purpose was to immobilize air. As long as the gap between layers remained undisturbed, heat stayed inside. This is why liners were suspended loosely rather than stitched flat. Any point of contact between inner and outer walls became a thermal bridge and reduced effectiveness. In Arctic and Eastern Front conditions, some units went even further by adding a third layer near sleeping height, basically creating a tent within a tent within a tent. Soldiers would sleep in the smallest enclosed volume possible, which meant there was less air to warm up. The amount of heat they put out stayed the same, but the losses dropped off sharply. Condensation control was actually a built-in advantage, not just some afterthought. Single-wall shelters really suffer from condensation. When warm breath hits a cold surface, moisture forms, and then, well, insulation performance just collapses. The liner system fixed this by putting the dew point between layers instead of right inside the living space. Moisture would condense on the outer shell, where it could freeze or evaporate without soaking bedding or clothing. This kept soldiers drier, and honestly, that mattered just as much as staying warm. Dry insulation holds on to heat, wet insulation just turns into dead weight. Modern homes, especially older ones that have been retrofitted with insulation but don't have proper vapor control, often struggle with this same problem. The wartime liner approach separated warmth from moisture naturally without needing plastic barriers or chemical membranes. Heat sources became more efficient too because the liner reduced how much heat was actually needed. Tent stoves in World War II, well, they were small, fuel-hungry, and downright dangerous if overused. But, the liner allowed those stoves to operate at a lower output while still keeping things nice and cozy. Instead of constantly feeding fuel to fight off heat loss, soldiers could maintain steady warmth with fewer inputs. This clever approach extended fuel supplies and reduced the risk of smoke and fire. And, hey, the same principle applies today. Any heating system works better when the surrounding structure leaks less heat. It's simple, really. Reducing demand is always more efficient than increasing output. The tent liner did exactly that. What makes this technique historically important is just how often it was improvised outside standard-issue equipment. Soldiers would hang blankets, parachute silk, spare uniforms, or even layers of newspaper as makeshift liners. As long as the material created a continuous inner skin and maintained an air gap, the effect stuck around. This adaptability is really why the concept spread so quickly across different units and theaters. In practical terms, the liner didn't have to be airtight, it just needed to be continuous and shielded from direct airflow. Even setups that weren't perfect still delivered measurable benefits. Modern homes tend to ignore this principle in favor of material-heavy solutions. Most contemporary insulation strategies focus on filling wall cavities with material. Fiberglass, foam, and mineral wool all rely on trapped air. But modern construction often, undermines this by letting air flow through gaps, outlets, and poorly sealed framing. The World War II temp method treated air control as the main goal, not just an incidental one. Homes today also try to heat entire volumes uniformly, even when only one room is being used. Wartime tents, though, concentrated warmth right where people actually lived and slept. That logic, honestly, is rarely applied these days, even with rising energy costs. This knowledge can be put to use immediately in real living spaces. You can apply the liner concept inside a modern home without making structural changes. Hanging thick curtains a few inches away from cold exterior walls creates a dead air zone that cuts down on heat loss. Using canopy-style bed enclosures brings back the tent-within-a-tent approach, letting your own body heat keep you comfortable overnight with hardly any heating. Temporary fabric walls can shrink the room volume in winter, making heating a whole lot more efficient. In rooms that aren't well insulated, freestanding bookcases set just a bit away from exterior walls act like rigid liners, trapping still air behind them. Even removable fabric panels inside garages or workshops follow the same basic logic. The key here is separation, not just piling on mass. For folks living in vans, cabins, or off-grid shelters, this lesson is even clearer. A lightweight inner liner will often outperform adding more insulation to the outer shell, especially when weight and moisture are big concerns. This technique is still relevant because, physics hasn't changed. World War II engineers were dealing with the same thermal problems we're facing today. Heat still moves by conduction, convection, and radiation. Still air still insulates better than most materials. Controlling airflow still matters more than just piling on more thickness. The tent liner method worked back then for the same reasons it works now. What's changed is really our willingness to accept simple solutions. Modern building culture often prefers permanent, expensive systems over adaptable, low-cost methods. The wartime tent trick goes to show that effective solutions don't need to be complicated to be powerful. This is knowledge worth preserving and using. Understanding how soldiers stayed warm with only limited resources isn't just nostalgia, it's practical history. These methods were honed under pressure, tested in extreme conditions, and proven by survival. They belong in any serious talk about historical living, energy efficiency, and resilience. If this kind of overlooked, field-tested knowledge means something to you, subscribe to Living Through the Seasons. Share this guide with folks who care about history that still works, because honestly, the past has a whole lot more to teach us than most modern manuals are willing to admit.